Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. Today we are going back to the basics in a way, and we're going to talk about 3 key components in wine that I think understanding these components really gives you a great general understanding of wine. Like, if you know these 3 things, you can talk about wine really intelligently, if that makes sense, or like you'll kind of know what you're talking about, and it'll be easier to figure out what you like and don't like in the wine, and maybe not figure it out so much as like how to say it out loud. You know, when you kind of have a taste and you're like, that feeling, that's the thing that like you either like or you don't like. I'm hoping once you understand these components, you might be able to put a word to that feeling. That's the goal. You're not really, my hope isn't that you become a total wine snob after learning these 3 things, but that you become a little more, I don't know, wine confident when you know these 3 things. So the 3 components we are going to talk about are tannin, acidity, and body. So let's dive into it. We're going to start off with the most complicated, or at least what I think is the most complicated of the 3, or maybe the most misunderstood of the 3. Because once you have an idea of what it is, it totally makes sense, but it gets confusing. So we're going to talk about tannin. Tannin in wine is what causes that tactile drying sensation and a sense of bitterness after you have a sip of wine. It's basically that feeling like you have cotton balls in your mouth, or like all the saliva has been just like sucked out of your mouth. Like you end up kind of trying to pull some saliva back in so that you can talk. That is the tannin in the wine. And interestingly enough, if you're a tea drinker, you might also be fairly familiar with tannin because tannin can be found in black tea. If you've ever left a tea steeping for too long, if you're anything like me and you're like, a glass of tea sounds great, and then you forget about it, and 15 minutes later you go to take a sip and holy moly, it's like, whoa, where did all the saliva go in my mouth? Those are the tannins at play in the tea, and that is also what is found in wine. Now, the question is, why does this cause that cotton ball feeling? I'm a huge why person. I always like to understand what is happening. So why do tannins cause this sensation? Tannins bind and they precipitate proteins, meaning they separate them out. Human saliva is full of proteins, which is what makes it so slippery. I know this is gross, but I'm telling you the why. A tannic red wine will bind to the saliva. And so this is basically what causes you to basically feel like all the saliva has been pulled out of your mouth because the tannin has bonded to the saliva, basically ridding your mouth of it. This explains why fatty foods actually can counteract tannins in wine. If you take a bite of fatty food, let's say like a bite of cheese, then you take a sip of tannic wine. The tannins in the wine are now split between the salivary proteins, so you still, it still causes those to dry up, but only half of them. And then the other half bond to the fat in the cheese. Since there is not as many tannins available for those salivary proteins, the wine feels less, tactily dry, less astringent, and ends up being smoother. Tannins, where do they come from in the wine? Why are they there? They come primarily from the skins, the seeds, and the stems of grapes. And now when we know this, it tells us that they are generally found only in red wines. Because when we're making a white wine, if you remember listening to my How is Wine Made podcast, I think just a few episodes ago, We learned that with white wine, you remove the skins and the stems and the seeds as quickly as possible. Versus the red wine, you leave it in contact with the juice of the grapes. So we're going to get more of those tannins in a red wine. You can also find them in an orange wine, which is where you use white grapes, but you leave them in contact with the skins and the seeds. So again, we get some tannin. You can find some of these tannins in a white wine, just not as much, right? Because we are removing the things that contain them away from the juice, away from the wine as quickly as possible. Tannin can also come from oak barrels. So even if it is a white wine that was not in contact with the skins or the seeds, if it was in contact with an oak barrel, you will get wood tannin, which is different than the skin tannin, or the grape tannin, I should say, but it still can cause that feeling. If you want the nitty-gritty science of it, I'm going to tell you it right now, but if this is like right over your head, that is totally fine too. We're just going to pretend to be scientists for a second. So there are essentially two types of wine tannins. There are condensed and hydrolyzable. Those are ones that are affected by water. The hydrolyzable tannins are generally absorbed into wine through the barrels, the oak barrels that it is aged in. They provide softer aromas and flavors favored in oaked wine. So our oak tannins are the hydrolyzable tannins. Condensed tannins, on the other hand, generally come from seeds, skins, and stems. These tannins are far more bitter and pronounced. These, again, come from the grapes. Now, if the tannin, you're like, okay, but like, why? Do we really want this? Do we want this like dry sensation feeling? And tannins do a lot for red wine. And there's a big reason for wanting a lot of tannin in your wine. For one thing, it helps red wines age well for decades. A wine that's bitter at a young age can become very soft and complex with age due to the tannins. Those big, bitter tannins will what's called polymerize. They'll create long chains with each other, which causes them to feel smoother and less harsh. Also, fun fact, wine tannins can be good for your health. Again, whenever I say this, please do not take this as Haley said red wine is healthy. That's not what I'm saying. But wine tannins can be good for your health. There's actually a study on the effect of wine and tea tannin on oxidation in the body. And in these tests, wine tannins resist oxidation, aka they are antioxidants. I know, right? I never thought about that word meaning that, but they are antioxidants, which we all know is a buzzword for something healthy, right? So the next time you're like, you should have a pomegranate to have some antioxidants, you can be, how about I have this glass of wine, this red wine, so I can have some antioxidants. Last thing I want to talk about when it comes to tannin is how to taste it in your wine. If you're still not quite sure what I mean when I say that dry sensation, that dry tactile, because here's the thing. The reason why tannin is confusing, I think, is because there's the term dry wine. And you might think because tannins cause a dry sensation, that when I say a dry wine, I must be referring to a tannic wine. That would only be logical, right? Of course, that's not what that means. A dry wine simply means a wine with no sugar. Dry means something totally different in the wine world, which is why I'm trying to be very clear that tannins cause a dry sensation, like that dry tactile sensation. And so this is where it gets kind of confusing. But if you're still like, what even is this dry tactile sensation? Here's a test that I learned from another wine expert. I'm going to call it the chipmunk test because I think it's hopefully the best way to explain it to you while you are listening to this. And what this does, so first of all, it's not going to tell you the level of tannin. So generally when you're tasting a wine, you're going to say it has either low, medium, or high tannins. This test isn't going to tell you low, medium, or high. All it's going to do is allow you to understand what tannin feels like in your mouth. So it's always going to feel like high tannin, no matter what wine you have. As long as it's a red wine, if you do this test with that red wine, it's going to feel like high tannin. I just want to make sure that's clear. It's not going to tell you low, medium, or high. It's just going to tell you what that sensation feels like in a more extreme, concentrated way. So the chipmunk test, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take a small to medium-sized sip of your red wine, and then you're going to put it behind your top lip. It kind of causes your top lip to kind of pooch out, as if that's a good word. I don't know. And you kind of look a little bit like a chipmunk or like a squirrel that's like storing something up there. Hold the red wine up against the gums and the back of your top lip for I don't know, even 3 seconds will do it. And then swallow the wine and then feel how that feels on your top lip. And what should happen is it should feel like your top lip is like stuck to your gums. Like you're going to want to like pull your lip away from the gums. You're going to want to run your tongue over that because it's going to feel so dry. That is that tactile dry sensation. Now take a bite of food, do something, kind of reset your palate, then go back to that glass of wine, have a regular sip, just a medium-sized sip, kind of move it around your mouth a little bit and swallow. And basically using, that feeling behind your top lip as like the high level of tannin, like that's like high on the scale. Use that as a reference to figure out, okay, how much do I feel that tannin everywhere in my mouth? Make sense? Hopefully. Okay, the next component that we're going to talk about in wine I think is far more straightforward, and that is acidity. Acidity is basically that fresh, tart, sour attribute of wine. Essentially, how much does it make you pucker up like you sucked on a lemon, or how much does it make you salivate? Basically the opposite of what tannin does. There are several different types of acidity in wine. The most prevalent are tartaric acid. Tartaric acid is naturally occurring in grapes. If a wine contains a lot of tartaric acid when bottled, that acidity will clump together into crystals when it's chilled. And those crystals are sometimes called tartrates or wine diamonds. They're totally safe to drink. They'll actually dissolve back into the wine as it is warmed up. But you'll often see them if you take a cork out of a bottle and you see those little crystals on the bottom of the cork. Those are called tartrates or wine diamonds. And they're just tartaric acid that's kind of clumped into crystals. Again, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your wine. The other types of acidity prevalent in wine are malic acid. This is a naturally occurring acid that is found in the grapes, which is also found in apples. So think about that kind of sour taste. And then also lactic acid. This is not naturally occurring in grapes, and it's actually created via a secondary fermentation. So after a wine goes through its first fermentation to create alcohol, sometimes winemakers will have it go through a second fermentation called malolactic fermentation. And the name of it tells us essentially what it's doing. It is transforming malic acid, which we just learned was naturally occurring in the grapes. It's what's found in like an apple. It's sour. And it converts it to lactic acid, which is the acidity that you'd find in like milk or a dairy product. So it's much smoother. This is what can cause that kind of buttery taste, not oak barrels. The buttery taste comes from that malolactic fermentation. Now, there are two ways to measure acidity in wine. First, you have total acidity. And this tells us the concentration of acids in the wine. I love producing this podcast for you every week. But here's the truth. It's not free. That's why I'm so grateful for sponsors like the following brands supporting me so that I can share everything I love about wine with you. If you're able, show them some support back. I'll be honest, I never really believed chocolate could pair well with wine until I partnered with Bon Chocolates for a local event. Rasha, the owner, created 4 incredible truffles that matched perfectly with the wines we were tasting. Bon Chocolates is a European-inspired chocolatier right here in the Seattle area, making beautiful bonbons and confections with fine chocolate and all natural ingredients. No preservatives, just pure flavor. Visit their local shop in Bothell or order online at bonchocolates.com. They make the perfect gift. Anyone else guilty of opening a bottle of wine for just one glass and then finding it a week later in the fridge totally undrinkable? Yeah, that used to happen to me all the time until I started using the VacuVin Wine Saver. It's so simple to use, easy to throw in my bag if I'm heading to a friend's, and it keeps wine fresh for up to 10 days, proven by independent lab testing. VacuVin invented the original wine saver back in 1986, and now over 40 million wine lovers around the world use it. With VacuVin, you get to enjoy wine on your terms. Open Italian Red for Tuesday pasta night, and it'll taste just as good a week later with pizza. Go to us.vacuvin.com and use code CORKANDFIZZ for 20% off your first order. I'm so grateful to the sponsors who help make this podcast possible. And today's sponsor is one I personally love, wine.com. You know I'm all about exploring new wines, but let's be real, it's not always easy to find unique bottles, especially if you're limited to what's near you. That's why I love shopping on wine.com. They have a huge selection, wines at every price point, user-friendly search features, and real wine experts ready to help you find your next favorite bottle. And here's a special deal just for you as a podcast listener. Get free shipping on orders over $150 at wine.com/corkfizz with promo code corkfizz. My recommendation? Build a mix of 6 to 12 bottles to try. Some you know, some you've never heard of. Not sure what to pick? Message me. I'd love to help. Or take advantage of the live chat wine experts at wine.com. The second way to measure is the pH, and the pH levels tells us how intense those acids taste. The acidity in a wine often provides the backbone that again is needed for long-term aging of a wine. Something that's interesting about acidity is that sugar can balance the acidity in wine without changing the amount of acidity or the pH of the wine. So many sweet wines, like dessert wines, are actually incredibly acidic. But it's not super noticeable when you're tasting because they balance each other out. A common one, a great example of this is Sauterne, which is a very famous dessert wine from Bordeaux, France. And the wines can be incredibly acidic, but there's more sugar than there is acidity, so you notice more of the sweetness. I liken this to think about making lemonade, right? You need to find that right balance between sour and sweet. And, lemon juice just on its own, super, super acidic, right? Then you can add a bunch of sugar. It doesn't change the pH level. There is still all that acidity present. You just don't taste it as acidic anymore because the sweetness, the sugar, balance it out. A lot of great wines do that too. Now, how do you test for acidity in wine? Well, you do the drool test, of course. Don't worry, I promise you're not actually going to be drooling, but it is fun to say it, isn't it? It's like, what are you going to make me do, Haley? I promise. It's not too silly. It's a little silly. If I see you doing this in public, I love it because I'm like, hey, there's a Cork and Fizz wine taster. Okay, what is the drool test? Drool test is where you take a sip of wine. Again, let's go for a medium-sized sip. You're going to move it around your mouth. Remember, this is what we call chewing the wine. It's like a slow motion mouthwash. And then after you swallow, you're going to tip your head forward, but make sure your mouth is shut. And basically what you're testing is, would you have drooled had I told you to not shut your mouth? And if the answer is yes, and especially a lot, that's high acidity. Not so much, medium to low acidity. So medium-sized sip, move the wine around your mouth. After you swallow, tip your head forward with your mouth shut. And then you're basically just seeing how much saliva you produce. I know it's weird. I know it might sound gross, but it's a great way to isolate the acidity in the wine. Okay, the last element in wine or the last structural element we're going to talk about in wine is the body of the wine. The body of the wine is the apparent weight of the wine in your mouth. How heavy does it feel? A wine can be light, medium, or full-bodied. That's our scale, right? So light on the low end, all the way up to full-bodied. Factors in wine that typically affect the body are either the alcohol content or the sugar content, or both. The body of the wine, it's really important when discussing wine. I mean, first, it's a great way to classify wines because there are over 10,000 grape varieties. So if we tried to just classify wine by grape varieties, we would be here a while, right? And so instead, it's easy to classify them by either a light-bodied wine, medium-bodied, or full-bodied wine. Body is also important when you're discussing wine and food pairing because it's the starting point. You often want to match the body of the wine with the intensity of the food. I was actually talking to my dad about this the other day. He's been drinking more wine than he ever used to before, but he still isn't a huge fan of red wines. And so when we went out to dinner, we actually had dinner over at my in-laws, and they were serving grilled steak, and they had some white wine on the table that he was enjoying, but my father-in-law brought out a red. And my dad tried it, and he wasn't a huge fan. He's like, I think I'm going to stick with the white wine with steak. But he asked me, why is it that people tend to pair red wine with steak? And the reason for this is, it is a tradition. It does really work well. And one of the big reasons is the body of the wine. Typically, red wines are fuller bodied. They have a little more weight to them. And we want to, when we're having a steak has a ton of flavor, a ton of stuff going on. So we want to match it, that intensity of the food, we want to match that with a fuller bodied wine. Because if you tried to match it with a light bodied white wine, the steak will overpower the wine. So a lot of times that's why we pair it with a red. Now, that's not saying you can't find a full-bodied white that will do the same job. You definitely can. And these are always guidelines, not like you have to do. He ended up having the steak with the Pinot Grigio, and it was great. He was totally happy with it. So you don't have to, but matching the intensity of the food with the body of the wine is a great place to start. It's also why you typically don't pair sushi, raw fish, right? Think super delicate, with a big full-bodied red, because in this case, the wine would overpower the food. Make sense? And like I said, yeah, we use body to classify wines. It's more reliable than the grape variety as well, because, a Chardonnay, if we called something a Chardonnay, there are a million different ways to make a Chardonnay. So it's not totally clear. But if I told you it was light or full-bodied, that actually tells you a little bit more about the wine. It's my favorite way for wine shops to be organized, and wine lists for that matter. I wish more places would organize their wine lists by light, medium, and full-bodied, because I think it makes more sense once you know what you like, oh, I'm looking for a light-bodied red. Like you want something that's, doesn't have a lot of oomph to it. Or you want a full-bodied white. And you know that, you want a white wine that has a lot of that oomph. And I think that's easier to find than looking by country or variety. How do you tell the body of a wine, right? How do you figure out what you like? The easiest way to tell the body of wine is actually to compare it to a type of milk. And again, I know I have such silly little things here, but they work so well. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I use my milk scale. So think a light-bodied wine is similar to skim milk. It's almost like, I want to say watery. I know that makes it sound bad. I don't mean that. But it just doesn't have a lot of weight or fat in it, right? So it just doesn't have that heaviness. So light-bodied is like a skim milk. Going up our scale, a medium-bodied wine is like a 2% milk. We've added some more fat in, right? So it's got a little more heft to it. It kind of, coats your mouth a little bit more. And then a full-bodied wine is like your whole milk. It's viscous. It coats your mouth. It has that weight to it. So think about comparing your wine to these different types of milk. Now, if you're like, Haley, I'm lactose intolerant and haven't had milk in years, I feel you, same. And so I've come up with my dairy-free milk comparison as well. So a light-bodied wine is like an almond milk. To me, those are usually lighter, more watery. Your medium-bodied wine is going to be like an oat milk or maybe even a soy milk. I've been drinking soy milk way more than oat milk lately. But again, it's got a little more weight to it. It's a little heavier, a little bit more oomph to it. And then finally, your full-bodied wine is like you've got a full-fat coconut milk. And it is rich and it's thick and it's viscous. All right, so light, medium, full-bodied wine, similar to almond milk, oat milk, coconut milk. Hopefully that helps. All right, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I really like going back to some of these basics things because they're things that I teach at all of my wine tastings, but I feel like they really help those aha moments where you're like, oh, that's why I like this wine and not this one, because it's, this one's higher acidity, or this one's more full-bodied, or this one has less tannin to it, right? Being able to figure that out is just so much fun. If you love this episode as much as I did, I'd love it if you take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And if you know a wine lover in your life that would enjoy it, please share it with them. In next week's episode, we're diving into an area of the world of wine that is growing quickly but is often overlooked, and that's technology in wine. Specifically, we're going to be talking about AI, and I know a lot of us have strong feelings about that, so definitely stick around, come back next week to listen to the interview. I'll be interviewing John Tan, who is the founder of Cork Vision, which is an AI co-pilot for wineries powered by a smart assistant named Corky. And yes, if that sounds kind of familiar, Corky is kind of based off Clippy from Microsoft Word. If you are of my generation, you are probably very familiar with Clippy, but apparently Corky is much, much, much more helpful. John spent decades building a tech company in New York, but then he moved to Napa without a plan, just a curiosity for wine and a willingness to get his hands dirty. That led to working harvests, supporting friends with their wineries, and ultimately realizing how much time and opportunity wineries were losing to outdated tools. So today, he's combining his tech background with deep industry empathy to build Cork Vision, a platform designed to help wineries sell smarter, connect with customers, and bring data to life through Corky. We had some really interesting conversations, and don't worry, I did not stray away from those questions of hey, yo, is this going to take our jobs? We talk about that. So come back next week to listen to that episode. Thanks again for listening. And if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. Cheers!